Hi, I'm Brent Stafford, and welcome to another segment of RegWatch on GFN.TV. Often regions in the world that could greatly benefit from tobacco harm reduction are the very places where THR policies struggle to take hold. And one of those places is more than a region, it's the continent of Africa. Joining us today to talk through the challenges is one of the leading THR advocates in Africa, Ngoma, Assistant Program Manager at Knowledge Action Change. Chim, thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, the African continent is obviously diverse as it is large. What can you tell us about smoking in Africa?
There is a long history of tobacco leaf in Africa, and it is in some societies deeply entrenched, and to the extent that they are sometimes used for traditional purposes, such as gifts during traditional ceremonies and chief installation ceremonies. In addition to that, the tobacco leaf is sometimes used for medicinal purposes in some societies, where it is used for dressing of wounds and as an aesthetic for toothache. And moving on to smoking, the problem is really big in Africa, and the WHO attests to this. It states that while smoking rates are on the decline in many parts of the world, smoking rates in Africa are on the rise. And it is projected that by 2025, smoking rates in Africa will have increased to 51 million.
Wow. So why is it on the rise in Africa?
All right. So the WHO attributes this increase to the increase in population, but it should also be noted that whilst the rest of the world is adopting tobacco harm reduction products, for example, in UK, they have embraced electronic cigarettes. In Sweden, they have embraced snus. In Japan, they have embraced heat-not-burn products. In Africa, the adoption rate of tobacco harm reduction is slow.
So give us an understanding about smoking in terms of the differences between men and women.
All right. So in Africa, smoking is predominantly a male habit, and there are wide differences in smoking rates between men and women. For example, in Lesotho, the smoking rates in men is about 52% as compared to less than 1% of women. And this is true and applies in many other African countries.
Chim, let's take a moment to talk a bit about your background. Fill us in on how you came to tobacco harm reduction.
Back in 2018, I used to work for a local NGO in Malawi on drugs and substance abuse. And I also worked as a citizen journalist where I used to write stories on various social issues happening around me and in my community for publication in the national platforms. But by this time, I had limited understanding of tobacco harm reduction and on effective ways on how to help smokers quit smoking. But after carefully analyzing the concept of tobacco harm reduction and content around it, and further relating tobacco harm reduction to other fields where harm reduction is practiced, I came to a personal conclusion that tobacco harm reduction is the most practical and effective solution for ending smoking in Africa. So from that time, I made a decision to advocate actively for tobacco harm reduction so that my friends, relatives, and everyone who is a smoker can get to know about tobacco harm reduction and make informed decisions regarding their health and escape an early grave as a result of smoking.
Were you a smoker yourself?
No. Of course, I have experimented with cigarettes and vaping products.
So yes, you don't always need to have been a smoker to have seen the value of tobacco harm reduction as a policy and to get out there and advocate for it. So let's move to vaping as a topic, because of course we talk about that endlessly here on RegWatch. Is vaping popular in Africa?
Vaping is not that popular in many African countries, and tobacco harm reduction in general is a newly formed concept, and a lot of people do not really know about the concept of tobacco harm reduction and vaping products. Of course, I know of other countries like South Africa where a lot of smokers are taking up vaping instead of smoking.
So has vaping made an impact when it comes to Africans quitting smoking?
At the moment, I would say that countries like South Africa, where vaping products are available at a better price and they are accessible by smokers, some smokers are able to switch to these safer means of consuming nicotine. So I would say that for countries like South Africa, vaping is making a difference. But in other countries like Malawi, where safer nicotine products like vaping products are limited in supply or they are ridiculously priced, I think it is yet to make a meaningful impact.
Now, is tobacco harm reduction a well-known concept?
Tobacco harm reduction, like I mentioned earlier, it is not a very well-known concept in many African countries. And I know of so many countries in Africa that do not have specific laws regarding the sale and use of safer nicotine products. And that means that tobacco harm reduction is not a widely known concept. But with the growing THR advocacy voice in Africa, I believe that smokers and authorities will get to know about tobacco harm reduction so that they can make them accessible and available for consumers to adopt them and switch to the life-saving technologies.
Well, I mean, it's actually as a concept that's been around, originating in the West, and there's many places that still can't get their head around THR overall harm reduction. And then when it comes to THR, it's even harder for them. They just think that people who smoke should just quit.
Yeah, that's true. And what Africa has as a problem at the moment is that it is sitting at the receiving end of almost everything, including information on vaping products and tobacco harm reduction in general. So yes, we are lagging behind on that, and our friends in the western part of the world are the ones on the forefront in the adoption of technologies like electronic cigarettes.
Now, we've been told that THR policies has had some real success in some regions of Africa. Do you think that's the case, and how so?
I don't really think that's the case because we have some problems here in Africa when it comes to the adoption of these safer nicotine products. And when policies are formulated on safer nicotine products, I think they are formulated in a way that they are prohibitory to those who are low earning smokers. For example, in Kenya, they have a law on electronic cigarettes. And in short, I would say that electronic cigarettes in Kenya are taxed. And the tax per electronic cigarette device is about $30, and per cartridge it is about $25, which is against the average monthly income of a smoker living in Kenya, which is about $125. And similarly, in South Africa, we are seeing, again, heavy tax measures on the same. I would say that such kind of measures are prohibitory for smokers who are on low incomes. So I think that tobacco harm reduction and vaping is facing a lot of resistance in Africa. The adoption of these products are facing some resistance. But when it comes to some success, I would say that some countries like South Africa, like you have putly said, they have not rushed into banning safer nicotine products like vaping, like other countries in Africa have done, like Uganda, Mauritius, Gambia. So I think this is some kind of a success story when it comes to not rushing into banning of safer nicotine products like vaping, because at least in South Africa, the product is being regulated rather than being banned. So yes, it could be considered as success story.
So, but as you say, though, it's clear that there is a war on vaping in many countries in Africa.
Yes, that's true. And this is mainly because there is some misinformation and disinformation going around by Bloomberg-funded organizations like the Campaign for Tobacco Free Kids and there are other beneficiaries who are propelling misinformation and disinformation that safer nicotine products like vaping products are as harmful as combustible cigarettes, thereby pushing for their banning. And like I said, there are other countries in Africa that have banned these safer nicotine products without following proper procedure. So I think countries like South Africa, which undertook a socio-economic impact assessment before coming up with a decision, is something that is commendable, and the rest of the continent, the rest of the countries on the continent should emulate.
Now, Bloomberg is obviously somebody that we'll talk about in just a little bit more depth in just a moment. But before we do that, besides obviously the incessant war on vaping, you had mentioned that affordability was an issue. What are the biggest obstacles to adopting vaping? And I know, say for nicotine products in general, it's important to bring that up because there are other products besides just vaping products.
The adoption and implementation of tobacco harm reduction and vaping in this case is facing a lot of obstacles here in Africa. And one of the obstacles revolves around the availability, accessibility, and affordability of these vaping products. Where these vaping products are available, they are priced so highly that an average income earning smoker cannot really afford. Secondly, there is misinformation going around on vaping. You remember about the EVALI outbreak in the USA? Africa received a lot of misinformation and disinformation about EVALI and vaping, and we saw some quotas starting to call for an outright ban of vaping products because of the misinformation they got about the EVALI from the media, because the media mainly framed news on the EVALI with alarming and fear frames. So these are some of the obstacles facing the adoption of safer nicotine products in Africa. On top of that, there are other smokers who live in rural areas and off the electrical grid. This means that these smokers cannot necessarily maintain and sustain their use of electronic cigarettes because they require constant recharging and stuff like that.
Yeah, one should never forget. Certainly, I'm well aware that I need to be like within 5 feet of a plug-in anywhere I go, or a very strong battery, and that's to, keep my use of vaping products going. Without power, forget it.
Yeah, true. And what there's smokers who live in rural areas and off the electrical grid are safer nicotine products that are maybe of low tech. I know every smoker is different, is unique. What works for one might not work for the other, but it would make sense for smokers living off the electrical grid in Malawi and the rest of the African continent to have access to these low-tech safer nicotine products so that at least they can have a choice.
Yeah, choice is what's key. I mean, we're fighting for that here in North America all the time. It's the same thing, access and choice of products. What about flavor bans? I mean, is that kicked around much?
Not at the moment, because what we are struggling with at the moment is the calls on banning of electronic cigarettes in general, not a flavor ban. So we haven't made such kind of a resistance as of yet.
Well, yeah, I mean, they're just going straight for the banning. Now, you were talking about Bloomberg. One of the biggest organizations that he funds and works with is called the Union. They don't get a lot of press. Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, a lot of people know what that group is. But the Union, they're the former Worldwide Tuberculosis Society, and they're based out of France. And their strong push is that they're kind of the regulatory shop that's a part of Bloomberg's entire process. And so we're showing some pictures from the Union right now. We've covered the Union to some extent. Now, they've got prepackaged off-the-shelf regulations that they force on LMICs, low and middle income countries, many of those obviously in Africa. Are you familiar with the Union, and have they been pushing this kind of ban regulation onto countries in Africa?
yes, I'm familiar with the union and what they are doing. And at the moment, I believe that there is something that is being done by the Union on Africa. What the Bloomberg is basically doing is imposing Western tobacco control measures on Africa, which are not only expensive but complex to implement for any resource-stretched economy or government in Africa. Additionally, I think what the Bloomberg is doing is basically propelling its ideologies and beliefs instead of pushing for science and evidence.
So then, Chim, is Bloomberg and what they're doing, do you see them presenting as the biggest obstacle for safer nicotine products in Africa?
Yes, I think that's one of the obstacles because what basically the Bloomberg is doing is initiating or pushing Africa into a war against nicotine instead of waging the war against smoking. So here, I think we are hitting the wrong target.
Now, is it fair to say that those, people pushing these policies, the Bloombergs, the Union, et cetera, are they taking advantage of governments in Africa for some way, in some reason?
I think that would be true because a lot of governments in Africa don't have enough resources. So basically, our governments look up to what the WHO says, what the Bloomberg says, because they get some funding from there. So basically, instead of the governments making their own decisions, making their own socio-economic impact assessments, and making science-based policies, they try to please the Bloomberg and the WHO and everyone who gives them a little of funding.
Yeah, I guess that's what kind of does make it a bit colonial in a certain way. So, I mean, what about the authorities then in Africa themselves? As you're saying, they're kind of just siding, I guess, with Bloomberg's people, and they're not embracing THR. So you have public health and you've got government. Is there anybody on your side?
The public health or the governments, to be specific here in Malawi, it is very difficult for them to meet the basic requirements for a good healthcare system, such that when you go to our public healthcare institutions, for example, here in Malawi, you go to a public healthcare institution, you barely find safer nicotine products, including the nicotine replacement therapies. So basically, there is some sort of neglect due to underfunding in many of these governments in Africa. But I've seen that, for example, in Malawi, there is some sort of willingness to embrace tobacco harm reduction. The authorities that we have involved or engaged here in Malawi have been receptive of the concept of tobacco harm reduction. But of course, we haven't really seen most of them or most of the governments in Africa openly talking about or sharing the health benefits of tobacco harm reduction. They are silent on that.
Chim, I know you'll be hosting one of the keynote presentations at the Global Forum on Nicotine conference in Warsaw, Poland, this June 16th to 18th. Why is a conference like GFN important for THR advocacy?
In the world of advocacy, there is a common phrase that goes, nothing about us without us. And the Global Forum on Nicotine attracts a wide range of participants, ranging from academicians, lawmakers, scientists, innovators, and many others coming together to discuss nicotine. And I think it is, the GFN is one of those platforms where consumer voices and views are supposed to be heard and taken into consideration before anyone implements or comes up with any initiative that would in turn affect the consumer.
Final question for you, Chim. How can advocates for THR outside of Africa get involved? Is there anything they can do to help out the effort there?
In Africa, we have a number of tobacco harm reduction advocates and advocacy groups. We have some in South Africa, Tanzania, Malawi, Zambia, Uganda, Kenya, Congo, Nigeria, and many other countries in Africa. And what I know is and believe in is for advocates to have a meaningful and lasting impact, they need a collective and unified voice on a global and regional levels. So I would really want to see some good collaboration between advocates in Africa and those advocates from the rest of the world, speaking about tobacco harm reduction, talking about tobacco harm reduction with one unified voice. And of course, this is something that I've already started to see, and I would like to applaud and I encourage this.